This is chapter 10 of The Order of Things by Michel Foucault, part 5 of chapter 10, Psychoanalysis and Ethnology. Psychoanalysis and ethnology occupy a privileged position in our knowledge, not because they have established the foundations of their positivity better than any other human science, and at last accomplished the old attempt to be truly scientific, but rather because, on the confines of all the branches of knowledge investigating man, they form an undoubted and inexhaustible treasure hoard of experiences and concepts, and above all, a perpetual principle of dissatisfaction, of calling into question, of criticism and contestation of what may seem, in other respects, to be established. Now, there is a reason for this that concerns the object they respectively give to one another, but concerns even more the position they occupy and the function they perform with the general space of the episteme. Psychoanalysis stands as close as possible, in fact, to that critical function which, as we have seen, exists within all the human sciences, in setting itself the task of making the discourse of the unconscious speak through the consciousness. Psychoanalysis is advancing in the direction of that fundamental region in which the relations of representation and finitude come into play, whereas all the other human sciences advance towards the unconscious only with their back to it, waiting for it to unveil itself as fast as consciousness is analyzed, as it were, backwards. Psychoanalysis, on the other hand, points directly towards it with a deliberate purpose, not towards that which must be rendered gradually more explicit by the progressive illumination of the implicit, but towards what is there and yet is hidden, towards what exists with the mute solidity of a thing, of a text closed in upon itself, or of a blank space in a visible text, and uses that quality to defend itself. It must not be supposed that the Freudian approach is the combination of an interpretation of meaning and a dynamics of resistance or defense. By following the same path as the human sciences, but with its gaze turned the other way, psychoanalysis moves towards the moment, by definition inaccessible to any theoretical knowledge of man, to any continuous apprehension in terms of signification, conflict, or function, at which the contents of consciousness articulate themselves, or rather stand gaping upon man's finitude. This means that, unlike the human sciences, which, even while turning back towards the unconscious, always remain within the space of the representable, psychoanalysis advances and leaps over representation, overflows it on the side of finitude, and thus reveals, where one had expected functions bearing their norms, conflicts burdened with rules, and significations forming a system. The simple fact that it is possible for there to be system, therefore signification, rule, therefore conflict, norm, therefore function. And in this region where representation remains in suspense, on the edge of itself, open in a sense to the closed boundary of finitude, we find outlined the three figures by means of which life, with its function and norms, attains its foundation in the mute repetition of death. Conflicts and rules their foundation in the naked opening of desire. Significations and systems their foundation in a language which is at the same time law. We know that psychologists and philosophers have dismissed all this as Freudian mythology. It was indeed inevitable that this approach of Freud's should have appeared to them in this way. To a knowledge situated within the representable, all that frames and defines on the outside the very possibility of representation can be nothing other than mythology. But when one follows the movement of psychoanalysis as it progresses, or when one traverses the epistemological space as a whole, one sees that these figures are in fact, though imaginary no doubt to the myopic gaze, the very forms of finitude, as it is analyzed in modern thought. Is death not that upon the basis of which knowledge in general is possible? So much so that we can think of it as a being. In the area of psychoanalysis, the figure of that empirico-transcendental duplication that characterizes man's mode of being within finitude. Is desire not that which remains always unthought at the heart of thought? And the law language, at once word and word system, that psychoanalysis takes such pains to make speak, is it not that in which all signification assumes an origin more distant than itself, but also that whose return is promised in the very act of analysis? It is indeed true that this death and this desire and this law can never meet within the knowledge that traverses in its positivity the empirical domain of man, but the reason for this is that they designate the conditions of possibility of all knowledge about man. And precisely when this language emerges in all its nudity, yet at the same time eludes all signification as if it were a vast and empty despotic system, when desire reigns in the wild state, as if the rigor of its rule had leveled all opposition, when death dominates every psychological function and stands above it as its unique and devastating norm, then we recognize madness in its present form. Madness as it is posited in the modern experience, as its truth and its alterity. In this figure, which is at once empirical and yet foreign to and in all that we can experience, our consciousness no longer finds, as it did in the 16th century, the trace of another world. It no longer observes the wandering of a straying reason. It sees welling up that which is perilously nearest to us, as if suddenly the very hollowness of our existence is outlined in relief. The finitude upon the basis of which we are and think and know is suddenly there before us, an existence at once real and impossible, thought that we cannot think, an object for our knowledge that always eludes it. This is why psychoanalysis finds in that madness par excellence, which psychiatrists term schizophrenia, its intimate, its most invincible torture. For, given in this form of madness, in an absolutely manifest and absolutely withdrawn form, are the forms of finitude towards which it usually advances unceasingly and interminably. From the starting point of that which is voluntarily, involuntarily offered to it in the patient's language. So, psychoanalysis recognizes itself when it is confronted with those very psychosis, which nevertheless, or rather for that very reason, it has scarcely any means of reaching. As if the psychosis were displaying in a savage illumination and offering in a mode not too distant, but just too close, that towards which analysis must make its laborious way. But this relation of psychoanalysis with what makes all knowledge in general possible in the sphere of the human sciences has yet another consequence, namely that psychoanalysis cannot be deployed as pure speculative knowledge or as a general theory of man. It cannot span the entire field of representation. attempt to evade its frontiers, or point towards what is more fundamental in the form of an empirical science constructed on the basis of careful observation. That breakthrough can be made only within the limits of a praxis in which it is not only the knowledge we have of man that is involved, but man himself. Man together with the death that is at work in his suffering, the desire that has lost its object, and the language by means of which, through which his law is silently articulated. All analytical knowledge is thus invincibly linked with a praxis, with that strangulation produced by the relation between two individuals, one of whom is listening to the other's language, thus freeing his desire from the object it has lost, making him understand he has lost it, liberating him from the ever-repeated proximity of death, making him understand that one day he will die. This is why nothing is more alien to psychoanalysis than anything resembling a general theory of man or an anthropology. Just as psychoanalysis situates itself in the dimension of the unconscious, of that critical animation which disturbs from within the entire domain of the sciences of man, so ethnology situates itself in the dimension of historicity, of that perpetual oscillation which is the reason why the human sciences are always being contested from without by their own history. It is no doubt difficult to maintain that ethnology has a fundamental relation with historicity, since it is traditionally the knowledge we have of peoples without histories. In any case, it studies, both by systematic choice and because of the lack of documents, the structural invariables of cultures rather than the succession of events. It suspends the long chronological discourse by means of which we try to reflect our own culture within itself, and instead it reveals synchronological correlations in other cultural forms. And yet, ethnology itself is possible only on the basis of a certain situation, of an absolutely singular event which involves not only our historicity, but also that of all men who can constitute the object of an ethnology. It being understood that we can perfectly well apprehend our own society's ethnology. Ethnology has its roots, in fact, in a possibility that properly belongs to the history of our culture, even more to its fundamental relation with the whole of history, and enables it to link itself to other cultures in a mode of pure theory. There is a certain position of the Western ratio that was constituted in its history and provides a foundation for the relation it can have with all other societies, even with the society in which it historically appeared. Obviously, this does not mean that the colonizing situation is indispensable to ethnology. Neither hypnosis nor the patient's alienation within the phantasmatic character of the doctor is constitutive of psychoanalysis. But just as the latter can be deployed only in the calm violence of a particular relationship and the transference it produces, so ethnology can assume its proper dimensions only within the historical sovereignty, always restrained but always present, of European thought and the relation that can bring it face to face with all other cultures as well as with itself. But this relation, insofar as ethnology does not seek to efface it, but on the contrary, deepens it by establishing itself definitively within it, does not imprison it within the circular system of actions and reactions proper to historicism. Rather, it places it in a position to find a way around that danger by inverting the movement that gave rise to it. In fact, instead of relating empirical contents, as revealed in psychology, sociology, or the analysis of literature and myth, to the historical positivity of the subject perceiving them, ethnology places the particular forms of each culture, the differences that contrast it with others, the limits by which it defines itself and encloses itself upon its own coherence within the dimension in which its relations occur with each of the three great positivities: life, need, and labor, and language. Thus, ethnology shows how, within a given culture, there occur the normalization of the broad biological functions, the rules that render possible or obligatory all the forms of exchange, production, and consumption, and the systems that are organized around or on the model of linguistic structures. Ethnology then advances towards that region where the human sciences are articulated upon that biology, that economics, and that philology and linguistics which, as we have seen, dominate the human sciences from such a very great height. This is why the general problem of all ethnology is in fact that of the relations of continuity or discontinuity between nature and culture. But in this mode of questioning, the problem of history is found to have been reversed, for it then becomes a matter of determining, according to the symbolic systems employed, according to the prescribed rules, according to the functional norms chosen and laid down, what sort of historical development each culture is susceptible of. It is seeking to reapprehend in its very roots the mode of historicity that may occur within that culture, and the reasons why its history must inevitably be cumulative or circular, progressive or subjected to regulating fluctuations, capable of spontaneous adjustments or subject to crisis, and thus is revealed the foundation of that historical flow within which the different human sciences assume their validity and can be applied to a given culture and upon a given synchronological area. Ethnology, like psychoanalysis, questions not man himself as he appears in the human sciences, but the region that makes possible knowledge about man in general. Like psychoanalysis, it spans the whole field of that knowledge in a movement that tends to reach its boundaries. But psychoanalysis makes use of the particular relation of the transference in order to reveal on the outer confines of representation, desire, law, and death, which outline at the extremity of analytic language and practice the concrete figures of finitude. Ethnology, on the other hand, is situated within the particular relation that the Western ratio establishes with all other cultures, and from that starting point, it avoids the representations that men in any civilization may give themselves, of their life, of their needs, of the significations laid down in their language, and it sees emerging behind those representations the norms by which men perform the functions of life, although they reject their immediate pressure, the rules through which they experience and maintain their needs, the systems against the background of which all signification is given to them. The privilege of ethnology and psychoanalysis, the reason for their profound kinship and symmetry, must not be sought, therefore, in some common concern to pierce the profound enigma, the most secret part of human nature. In fact, what illumines the space of their discourse is much more the historical a priori of all the sciences of man. Those great cesuras, furrows, and dividing lines which traced man's outline in the Western episteme and made him a possible area of knowledge. It was quite inevitable then that they should both be sciences of the unconscious, not because they reach down to what is below consciousness in man, but because they are directed towards that which, outside man, makes it possible to know with a positive knowledge that which is given to or eludes his consciousness. On this basis, a certain number of decisive facts become comprehensible. And the first is this, that psychoanalysis and ethnology are not so much two human sciences among others, but that they span the entire domain of those sciences, that they animate its whole surface, spread their concepts throughout it, and are able to propound their methods of decipherment and their interpretations everywhere. No human science can be sure that it is out of their debt or entirely independent of what they may have discovered, or certain of not being beholden to them in one way or the other. But their development has one particular feature, which is that, despite their quasi-universal bearing, they never for all that come near to a general concept of man. At no moment do they come near to isolating a quality in him that is specific, irreducible, and uniformly valid wherever he is given to experience. The idea of a psychoanalytics of anthropology and the idea of a human nature reconstituted by ethnology are no more than pious wishes. Not only are they able to do without the concept of man, they are also unable to pass through it, for they always address themselves to that which constitutes his outer limits. One may say of both of them that what Levi Strauss said of ethnology, that they dissolve man. Not that there is any question of revealing him in a better, purer, and as it were more liberated state, but because they go back towards that which foments his positivity. In relation to the human sciences, psychoanalysis and ethnology are rather counter sciences, which does not mean that they are less rational or objective than the others, but that they flow in the opposite direction, that they lead them back to their epistemological basis, and that they ceaselessly unmake that very man who is creating and recreating his positivity in the human sciences. Lastly, we can understand why psychoanalysis and ethnology should have been constituted in confrontation, in a fundamental correlation, since totem and taboo, the establishment of a common field for these two, the possibility of a discourse that could move from one to the other without discontinuity, the double articulation of the history of individuals upon the unconscious of culture, and of the historicity of those cultures upon the unconscious of individuals, has opened up, without doubt, the most general problems that can be posed with regard to man. One can't imagine what prestige and importance ethnology could possess if, instead of defining itself in the first place, as it has done until now, as the study of societies without history, it were deliberately to seek its object in the area of the unconscious processes that characterize the system of a given culture. In this way, it would bring the relation of historicity, which is constitutive of all ethnology in general, into play within the dimension in which psychoanalysis has always been deployed. In so doing, it would not assimilate the mechanisms and forms of a society to the pressure and repression of collective hallucinations, thus discovering, though on a larger scale, what analysis can discover at the level of the individual. It would define as a system of cultural unconsciousness the totality of formal structures which render mythical discourse significant, give their coherence and necessity to the rules that regulate needs, and provide the norms of life with a foundation other than that to be found in nature or in a pure biological functions. One can imagine the similar importance that a psychoanalysis would have if it were to share the dimension of an ethnology, not by the establishment of a cultural psychology, not by the sociological explanation of phenomena manifested at the level of individuals, but by the discovery that the unconscious also possesses, or rather that it is in itself, a certain formal structure. By this means, ethnology and psychoanalysis would succeed, not in superimposing themselves on one another, nor even perhaps in coming together, but in intersecting like two lines, differently oriented, one proceeding from the apparent elision of the signified in a neurosis to the lacuna in the signifying system, through which the neurosis found expression. The other proceeding from the analogy between the multiple things signified, in mythologies, for example, to the unity of a structure whose formal transformations would yield up the diversity existing in the actual stories. It would thus not be at the level of the relations between the individual and society, as has often been believed, that psychoanalysis and ethnology could be articulated one upon the other. It is not because the individual is a part of his group. It is not because a culture is reflected and expressed in a more or less deviant manner in the individual that these two forms of knowledge are neighbors. In fact, they have only one point in common, but it is an essential and inevitable one, the one at which they intersect at right angles. For the signifying chain by which the unique experience of the individual is constituted is perpendicular to the formal system on the basis of which the significations of a culture are constituted. At any given instant, the structure proper to individual experience finds a certain number of possible choices and of excluded possibilities in the systems of the society. Inversely, at each of their points of choice, the social structures encounter a certain number of possible individuals and others who are not, just as the linear structure of language always produces a possible choice between several words or several phonemes at any given moment, but always excludes all others. Whereupon there is formed the theme of a pure theory of language, which would provide the ethnology and the psychoanalysis thus conceived with their formal mode. There would thus be a discipline that would cover in a single movement both the dimension of ethnology that relates the human sciences to the positivities in which they are framed, and the dimension of psychoanalysis that relates the knowledge of man to the finitude that gives its foundation. In linguistics, one would have a science perfectly founded in the order of positivities exterior to man, since it is a question of pure language, which, after traversing the whole space of the human sciences, would encounter the question of finitude, since it is through language and within it that thought is able to think, so that it is in itself a positivity with the value of a fundamental. Above ethnology and psychoanalysis, or more exactly, interwoven with them, a third counter-science would appear to traverse, animate, and disturb the whole constituted field of the human sciences. And by overflowing it both on the side of positivities on that of finitude, it would form the most general contestation of that field. Like the two other counter sciences, it would make visible in a discursive mode the frontier forms of the human sciences. Like them, it would situate its experience in those enlightened and dangerous regions where the knowledge of man acts out in the form of the unconscious and of historicity, its relation with what renders them possible. In exposing it, these three counter sciences threaten the very thing that made it possible for man to be known. Thus, we see the destiny of man being spun before our very eyes, but being spun backwards. It is being led back by those strange bobbins to the forms of its birth, to the homeland that made it possible. And is that not one way of bringing about its end? For linguistics no more speak of man himself than do psychoanalysis and ethnology. It may be said that in playing this role, linguistics is doing no more than resuming the functions that had once been those of biology or of economics. When, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, an attempt was made to unify the human sciences under concepts borrowed from biology or economics. But linguistics may have a much more fundamental role, and for several reasons. First, because it permits, or in any case strives to render possible, the structuration of contents themselves. It is therefore not a theoretical reworking of knowledge acquired elsewhere, the interpretation of an already accomplished reading of phenomena. It does not offer a linguistic version of the facts observed in the human sciences. It is rather the principle of a primary decipherment. To a gaze forearmed by linguistics, things attain to existence only insofar as they are able to form the elements of a signifying system. Linguistic analysis is more a perception than an explanation. That is, it is constitutive of its very object. Moreover, we find that by means of this emergence of structure as an invariable relation within a totality of elements, the relation of the human sciences to mathematics has opened up once more and in a wholly new dimension. It is no longer a matter of knowing whether one can quantify results or whether human behavior is susceptible of being introduced into the field of a measurable probability. The question that arises is that of knowing whether it is possible without a play on words to employ the notion of structure, or at least whether it is the same structure that is referred to in mathematics and in the human sciences. A question that is central if one wishes to know the possibilities and rights, the conditions and limitations of a justified formalization. It will be seen that the relation of the sciences of man to the axis of the formal and the a priori disciplines, a relation that had not been essential till then, and as long as the attempt was made to identify it with the right to measure, returns to life and perhaps becomes fundamental now. that within the space of the human sciences there emerges their relation both to the empirical positivity of language and to the analytic of finitude. The three axes which define the volume proper to the sciences of man thus become visible, and almost simultaneously so, in the questions they pose. Lastly, as a result of the importance of linguistics and of its application to the knowledge of man, the question of the being of language, which, as we have seen, is so intimately linked with the fundamental problems of our culture, reappears in all its enigmatic insistence. With the continually extended use of linguistic categories, it is a question of growing importance, since we must henceforth ask ourselves what language must be in order to structure in this way what is nevertheless not in itself either word or discourse, and in order to articulate itself on the pure forms of knowledge by a much longer and much more unexpected path, we are led back to the place that Nietzsche and Mallarmé signposted when they first asked, "Who speaks?" And the second saw his glittering answer in the word itself. The question as to what language is and its being is once more of the greatest urgency. At this point, where the question of language arises again, and with such heavy overdetermination, and where it seems to lay siege on every side to the figure of man, that figure which had once taken the place of classical discourse, contemporary culture is struggling to create an important part of its present, and perhaps of its future. On the one hand, suddenly, very near to all these empirical domains, questions arise, which before had seemed very distant from them. These questions concern a general formalization of thought and knowledge, and at a time when they were still thought to be dedicated solely to the relation between logic and mathematics. They suddenly open up the possibility in the task of purifying the old empirical reason by constituting formal languages, and of applying a second critique of pure reason on the basis of new forms of mathematical a priori. However, at the other extremity of our culture, the question of language is entrusted to that form of speech, which has no doubt never ceased to pose it, but which is now, from the first time, posing it to itself. That literature in our day is fascinated by the being of language, is neither the sign of an imminent end nor proof of a radicalization. It is a phenomenon whose necessity has its roots in a vast configuration in which the whole structure of our thought and our knowledge is traced. But if the question of formal languages gives prominence to the possibility or impossibility of structuring positive contents, a literature dedicated to language gives prominence in all their empirical vivacity to the fundamental forms of finitude, from within language experienced and traversed as language, in the play of its possibilities extended to their furthest point. What emerges is that man has come to an end, and that by reaching the summit of all possible speech, he arrives not at the very heart of himself, but at the brink of that which limits him. In that region where death prowls, where thought is extinguished, where the promise of the origin interminably recedes, it was inevitable that this new mode of being of literature should have been revealed in works like those of Artaud or Roussel, and by men like them. In Artaud's work, language having been rejected as discourse and reapprehended in the plastic violence of the shock, is referred back to the cry, to the tortured body, to the materiality of thought, to the flesh. In Roussel's work, language having been reduced to powder by a systematically fabricated chance, recounts interminably the repetition of death and the enigma of divided origins. And as if this experiencing of the forms of finitude in language were insupportable or inadequate, perhaps its very inadequacy was insupportable. It is within madness that it has manifested itself, the figure of finitude thus positing itself in language as that which unveils itself within it, but also before it, preceding it, as that formless, mute, unsignifying region where language can find its freedom. And it is indeed in this space, thus revealed, that literature, first with surrealism, though still in a very much disguised form, then and more purely with Kafka, Bataille, and Blanchot, posited itself as experience of death, and in the element of death, of unthinkable thought, and in its inaccessible presence, of repetition, of original innocence, always there at the nearest and yet always the most distant limit of language, as experience of finitude, trapped in the opening and the tyranny of that finitude. It is clear that this return of language is not a sudden interruption in our culture. It is not the eruptive discovery of some long buried evidence. It does not indicate a folding back of thought upon itself in the movement by which it emancipates itself from all content, or a narcissism occurring within a literature freeing itself at last from what it has to say in order to speak henceforth only about the fact that it is language stripped naked. It is, in fact, the strict unfolding of Western culture in accordance with the necessity it imposed upon itself at the beginning of the 19th century. It would be false to see in this a general indication of our experience, which may be termed formalism, the sign of a drying up, of a rarefaction of thought losing its capacity for reapprehending the plenitude of contents. It would be no less false to place it from the outset upon the horizon of some new thought or new language. It is within the very tight-knit, very coherent outlines of the modern episteme that this contemporary experience found its possibility. It is even that episteme which, by its logic, gave rise to such an experience, constituted it through and through, and made it impossible for it not to exist. What occurred at the time of Ricardo, Cuvier, and Bopp, the form of knowledge that was established with the appearance of economics, biology, and philology, the thought of finitude laid down by the Kantian critique as philosophy's task, all that still forms the immediate space of our reflection. We think in that area. And yet the impression of fulfillment and end of end, the muffled feeling that carries and animates our thought, and perhaps lulls it to sleep with the facility of its promises, and makes us believe that something new is about to begin. Something we glimpse only as a thin line of light low on the horizon. That feeling and that impression are perhaps not ill-founded. It will be said that they exist, that they have never ceased to be formulated over and over again since the early 19th century. It will be said that Hölderlin, Hegel, Feuerbach, and Marx all felt this certainty that in them a thought and perhaps a culture were coming to a close, and that from the depths of a distance, which was perhaps not invincible, another was approaching. In the dim light of dawn, in the brilliance of noon, or in the dissension of the falling day. But this close, this perilous imminence, whose promise we fear today, whose danger we welcome, is probably not of the same order. Then the task enjoined upon thought by that of enunciation was to establish for man a stable sojourn upon this earth from which the gods had turned away or vanished. In our day, and once again Nietzsche indicated the turning point from a long way off. It is not so much the absence or the death of God that is affirmed as the end of man. That narrow, imperceptible displacement, that recession in the form of identity, which are the reason why man's finitude has become his end. It becomes apparent then that the death of God and the last man are engaged in a contest with more than one round. It is not the last man who announced that he has killed God, thus situating his language, his thought, his laughter in the space of that already dead God, yet positing himself also as he who has killed God, and whose existence includes the freedom and the decision of that murder. Thus, the last man is at the same time older and yet younger than the death of God. Since he has killed God, it is he himself who must answer for his own finitude. But since it is in the death of God that he speaks, thinks, and exists, his murder itself is doomed to die. New gods, the same gods, are already swelling the future ocean. Man will disappear. Rather than the death of God, or rather in the wake of that death, and in profound correlation with it, what Nietzsche thought heralds is the end of his murderer. It is the explosion of man's face in laughter and the return of masks. It is the scattering of the profound stream of time by which he felt himself carried along, and whose pressure he suspected in the very being of things. It is the identity of the return of the same with the absolute dispersion of man. Throughout the 19th century, the end of philosophy and the promise of an approaching culture were no doubt one and the same thing as the thought of finitude and the appearance of man in the field of knowledge. In our day, the fact that philosophy is still and again in the process of coming to an end, and the fact that in it perhaps, though even more outside and against it, in literature as well as in formal reflection, the question of language is being posed, prove no doubt that man is in the process of disappearing. For the entire modern episteme, that which was formed towards the end of the 18th century and still serves as the positive ground of our knowledge, that which constituted man's particular mode of being and the possibility of knowing him empirically, that entire episteme was bound up with the disappearance of discourse and its featureless reign. With the shift of language towards objectivity and with its reappearance in multiple form, if this same language is now emerging with greater and greater insistence in a unity that we ought to think but cannot as yet do so, is this not the sign that the whole of this configuration is now about to topple, and that man is in the process of perishing as the being of language continues to shine ever brighter upon our horizon? Since man was constituted at a time when language was doomed to dispersion, will he not be dispersed when language regains its unity? And if that were true, would it not be an error, a profound error, since it could hide from us what should now be thought? To interpret our actual experience as an application of the forms of language to the human order? Ought we not rather to give up thinking of man, or to be more strict, to think of this disappearance of man and the ground of possibility of all the sciences of man as closely as possible in correlation with our concern with language? Ought we not to admit that since language is here once more, man will return to that serene non-existence in which he was formerly maintained by the imperious unity of discourse? Man had been a figure occurring between two modes of language. One, or rather, he was constituted only when language, having been situated within representation, and, as it were, dissolved in it, freed itself from that situation at the cost of its own fragmentation. Man composed his own figure in the interstices of that fragmented language. Of course, these are not affirmations. They are at most questions to which it is not possible to reply. They must be left in suspense, where they pose themselves only with the knowledge that the possibility of posing them may well open the way to a future thought. Okay, that's the end of part 5 of chapter 10 of The Order of Things by Michel Foucault. All right. Okay.